you to write down this chart. We've already been talking about it.
Već smo govorili o ovoj tablici, ali htio bih da je možda si prepišete.
And this will help us as we do the rest of the discussion.
I pomoći će nam u daljnjoj raspravi.
When we talk about the callings of disciples,
Kada govorimo o pozivu učenika,
I see four main callings.
Prepoznajem 4 glavna poziva.
And it's easy to confuse them chronologically and think that maybe the same thing.
Lako ih je pobrkati i da nije kronološki i onda mislite da to sve je jedna te ista stvar.
And I think if we draw this chart, it will help us to keep in mind that there are four different callings of disciples.
Ako se preslikamo ovu tablicu, vidjet ćemo da postoje 4 vrste poziva učenika.
We briefly looked at the first one in the chapter 1 of John.
Prvi smo već malo pogledali u
We
Ivanovom
didn't
evanđelju.
read the whole thing. We stopped at part of it.
Nismo sve pročitali, stali smo negdje na pola.
But in that calling, Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel, who's probably the same as Bartholomew, and John were called.
Znači tu su ovi učenici koji su navedeni.
They were John's disciples. He points to Jesus, behold the Lamb of God, and they become Jesus'
To su
disciples.
Ivanovi učenici, kada je on rekao, evo jaganca Božjega, i onda oni su bili pozvani.
And you said that they were John's disciples before they became his. Good.
Znači prvo su bili Ivanovi učenici, pa su postali Isusovi učenici.
At this point, these disciples are still going to presumably their normal jobs, their normal life.
Oni dalje rade i bave se svojim svakodnevnim životom.
But in the synoptic calling of Matthew 4:18 through 22 and Mark 1:16 and following,
Međutim, u ovom odlomku Matej 4:18 i Marko 1:16,
these same disciples
ovi isti učenici
are now called to be fishers of men.
sada su pozvani da budu ribarima ljudi.
So their main job is not going to be what it used to be, fishermen or whatever it might have been, but now it's going to be basically evangelizing full time as ministers.
Oni više neće biti ribari ili koje god da su imali zanimanje prije, nego će sada biti evangelizatori, ribari ljudi.
And this is one of our main jobs, to be fishers of men.
I to je jedan od naših glavnih zadataka, da budemo ribari ljudi.
Whatever your job is, probably nobody in here is a fisherman, but your job needs to see people, catching people as whatever you do, ultimately we're trying to draw people to Christ.
Možda
Catch
niko
them
nije
for
od vas
Christ.
ribar, ali vaš zadatak ili zanimanje ste da ljude lovite za Krista.
Now, the third calling here
Treća skupina ili treći poziv
is in Luke chapter 5,
je u Lukinom evanđelju 5. poglavlju,
1 through 11.
1 do 11.
And there's a fairly large debate among theologians whether actually I'm incorrect on what I wrote here on the board.
I teolozi se tu malo ne slažu možda svi,
More than a few
kao
people,
što sam ja ovo stavio tu na pločicu tu.
more than a few people think that number 2 and number 3 are exactly the same calling.
Neki misle da je prvi i ovaj drugi poziv učenika jedan te isti.
So I'm being honest right at the front end that you realize that.
Iskren sam prema vama od samog početka da uviđete to i da ste upoznati sa tim.
The same people are involved, some of the same words are involved.
Isti ljudi su uključeni, iste riječi se koriste.
So there are reasons to think that maybe these are the same calling.
Tako da ima opravdani razlog da se pomisli da je to jedan te isti poziv bio.
But I think that they're different.
Vjerujem da su drugačiji pozivi.
And I'll give you a few reasons why.
Daću i nekoliko razloga zašto.
In Matthew and Mark,
U Mateju i u Markovom evanđelju
the disciples are in the process of fishing.
učenici su u procesu hvatanja ribe.
And I have the verses written down. I don't know if they want me to give them. Maybe keep going, yeah.
Idemo dalje, ja imam stihove zapisane.
But in Luke, they're not in the process of fishing, they're finished fishing.
U Lukinom slučaju, oni nisu u procesu ribarenja, oni su završili s tim.
So, where Jesus saw the disciples is different in the two passages.
Znači, kada Isus vidio te učenike, oni su bili u drugačijem situaciji.
Second, where Jesus calls the disciples is different.
I situacija kada poziva učenike je drugačije.
In Matthew and Mark,
U Mateju i Marku,
Jesus was walking along the shore when he calls them.
Isus je hodao obalom kada ih je pozvao.
But in Luke 5, 10 and 11, Jesus is sitting in a boat.
Ali u Luka 5, 10 i 11 kaže Isus je sjedio u lađici.
So the calling is different.
Tako da je poziv drugačiji.
The content of the call is different in
I
each
sadržaj poziva je drugačiji.
question. No? So we're talking about why number 2 and number 3 are different, in case anybody's slightly
Pitanje je zašto je drugo ili treće drugačije.
I see significant differences and therefore make them different callings.
Ja vidim razlike u pozivu, zato ih odvajam. Zato drugi i treći poziv.
The content is different between the 2 and 3.
I sadržaj je drugačiji između drugog i trećeg
In
poziva.
Matthew and Mark, he says, follow me.
U Mateju Marko kaže slijedite me.
And in Luke 5:10, he says, fear not.
A u Luka 5 kaže ne boj se.
And he uses a different word for you will catch men. Different Greek word.
I koriste drugu grčku riječ kada kaže od sada ćeš loviti ljude.
The command directed them is at different people.
Zapovjed je upućena drugim ljudima.
In Matthew and Mark, there's 2 brothers.
U Mateju i Marku tu su dva para braće. Nisu dva para braće. Ali dva
Andrew and Peter, James and John.
Dva para braće.
But in Luke, it's to Simon Peter alone.
U Lukinom evanđelju to je samo Šimonu.
And Jesus' actions differ.
I Isusova djelo ili ponašanje drugačije.
In Matthew and Mark, he's just passing by.
U Mateju i Marku on je u prolazu, šeće.
In Luke, he teaches crowds.
U Lukinom zapisu on poučava mnoštvo.
I made this little chart with all this information on it.
Napravio sam si tablicu vlastitu ovdje za sve ovo.
If somebody's interested, you could take a picture of it. Maybe I should have put it up here, but
Ako želite, možete to poslije poslikati.
if you're interested in all those details, I have them on.
Ali imam sve te detalje na ovoj tablici.
So there's 5 major differences about the content and the place.
5 glavnih razlika između sadržaja, mjesta,
The calling, the content, the command,
poziva, zapovjedi
and the actions
i
of what they're doing.
odaziva ili
And
onoga što su oni radili
what Jesus is doing is different.
i što Isus čini, što je drugačije.
So for all those reasons, I think number 2 and 3 are different callings.
Tako da vjerujem su drugi i treći poziv drugačiji.
And what Jesus is doing in number 3 is he's calling them, renewing them to discipleship. Once again, you need to do this.
Isus ih ovdje obnavlja na učeništvo. Vi ovo trebate činiti.
They had fallen down on doing what he had called them to do, to be fishers of men, and now he's renewing the call.
Znači on ovdje njima obnavlja svoj poziv.
This is encouraging to us. Sometimes we fall down in what God has called us to do.
Nekada odustanemo ili ne radimo ono na što nas je Bog pozvao da činimo.
And just like Jesus did to those disciples, he calls us again to renew again what we're supposed to be
I kao
doing.
sa ovim učenicima, Isus nas ponovo poziva, podsjeća nas da radimo ono što trebamo činiti.
The fourth call is the calling of the 12 to be apostles.
Četvrti poziv je 12-torici učen da budu apostolima.
Let's read Luke chapter 6.
Luka 6.
And Jesus is calling in verse 12 of the disciples to be apostles.
I njegov poziv 12-torici da budu apostolima.
You already read it?
No.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Want to read?
Let's just make sure that's where. Let's start, in verse Luke 6, 12. And then let's read 12 and 13.
A dogodi se tih dana da izađe na goru da se pomoli, te provede noć u molitvi Bogu. I kad svane dan, dozva svoje učenike, te izabrao od njih 12-toricu koje prozva i apostoli.
So this fourth call is a more narrow call than the previous ones, even though same people are being involved.
Ovaj poziv je još uži poziv, iako se isti ljudi spominju.
First call, they're still doing their jobs.
U prvom pozivu oni dalje se bave svojim poslom.
Second call, they're to leave their jobs and be fishers of men.
U drugom ih on poziva da ostave svoje posle, da budu ribari ljudi.
The third call, they've fallen in doing that, and he renews the call to be fishers of men.
U trećem pozivu on ih obnavlja, ponovo zove da rade ono što su pozvani.
And in the fourth call, he's calling them not just to disciple, to learn from him, to be disciples.
U četvrtom pozivu ne samo da budu njegovi učenici, da uče od njega,
but now to be apostles.
već da budu i apostoli.
What does apostle mean?
Što znači apostol?
The sent one, is that what you said? Yeah, yeah. They are sent to be his representatives.
Oni su poslani da budu njegovi predstavnici.
Kind of like an ambassador is sent to represent the country that he or she is an ambassador to. Jesus is sending them to represent him.
Kao što je ambasador poslan da predstavlja zemlju, tako on njih šalje da njega predstavlja.
And in the scriptures, the word apostle is used different ways.
I sada pismo riječ apostol se koristi na više načina.
There's the apostles of Christ, the 12,
Postoje 12-torica apostola
that walked with Christ, were chosen by Christ in this passage.
koji su odabrani od Krista, koji su hodili s Kristom, kao što je ovaj ulomak ovdje.
But there seems to be another meaning of apostles, not a big A we might say, of Jesus, but of the churches.
Ali imamo i drugu riječ za apostol, koja je apostoli za crkvu ili prema crkvama. Znači ne apostoli sa velikim A.
Where the church sends out representatives of the churches, almost like missionaries.
Gdje crkva šalje apostole, nešto poput slanje misionara.
So, in this passage of Luke 6:12,
U ovom ulomku Luka 6:12,
Jesus spends a whole night in prayer before he calls the 12 apostles.
Isus je proveo noć u molitvi prije nego što je prozvao svoje apostole.
The Gospel of Luke emphasizes the prayer life of Jesus.
Evanđelje po Luki naglašava Isusov molitveni život.
Luke is the only gospel that says when he was baptized, Jesus was praying as he was baptized.
Jer Luka kaže da dok su krštavali Isusa da se molio.
And as he was praying and being baptized, the Spirit comes upon
Dok je
Jesus.
molio, dok je bio kršten, Duh Sveti je sišao.
And Luke here shows that Jesus prays before he chooses the 12 disciples.
Luka ističe kako se Isus moli prije nego što odabire 12-toricu.
This is a good example as we might choose disciples.
To je dobar primjer za nas što činiti prije nego što odabiremo učenike.
And how long does Jesus pray, according to verse 12?
Prema 12. stihu, koliko je dugo Isus molio? The whole night.
Not 10 minutes,
Ne 10 minuta,
not a half hour.
ne pola sata.
For most of us, praying a half hour would be like, wow, that's a
Većina
lot.
nas pola sata moliti je puno.
A whole hour, wow, you're a star, you're doing great.
Cijeli
Great.
sat, ti si zvijezda.
Whole night,
A
wow.
cijelu noć.
Isn't Jesus God?
Zar Isus Bog?
Doesn't he already know who to pick?
Zar već ne zna koga će odabrati?
But he wants to spend that time fellowshipping with the Father.
On je želio imati to zajedništvo s Ocem.
And before he chooses 12 apostles, he prays the whole night.
I prije nego što odabire 12-toricu, on se moli cijelu noć.
After prayer, verse 13,
Nakon molitve u 13. stihu,
he calls the disciples
on doziva svoje
and he chooses 12 of them
12-toricu i proziva ih
that he gives the name of apostles.
apostolima.
So here we see a clear delineation between discipleship in the first three categories and apostleship in the fourth category.
Vidimo razliku učeništva između prva tri poziva i četvrtog poziva.
And even in the New Jerusalem, the 12 apostles
Čak i u Novom Jeruzalemu 12-torica
will have
apostola
a special place around the New Jerusalem building.
će imati posebna mjesta oko Novog Jeruzalema.
I'm trying to remember. I didn't look this up before I talked. Is it the gates that have the apostles' name on them, or is it the...
Da li vrata imaju njihova imena? Nisam pogledao ulomak prije da bi vam to citirao sada.
Help me here. I need help from the Zal.
Ajde, uključite se, nemojte se spavati.
Do you know what I'm talking about? Does this...
Znate o čemu govorim?
The foundation stones, my wife said. I believe her.
Vjerujem svojoj ženi, kaže da su 12 foundation stones. Oni su 12 temelja.
I don't remember the verse. Does anybody remember?
Ko zna koji stih? Googlajte.
The New Jerusalem
Novi Jeruzalem.
in the book of Revelation needs to be near the end, right?
Krivenju, to je pod kraj tamo negdje.
The 12 foundation stones have the name of the...
12 temelja
Okay,
tamo
chapter
nose.
21,
21. poglavlje,
I found it, verse 14.
14. stih. I zidine grada imahu 12 temelja, a na njima imena 12-torice apostola Jagančevih.
And what's interesting in verse 12, the 12 gates, this is what confused me. I
Ovo je
wasn't sure
mene
about.
malo zbunilo. U 12. stihu kaže i zidine, you want to read it?
Yeah.
I zidine je imao velike i visoke s 12 vratima, a na vratima 12 anđela i napisana imena, to su imena 12 plemena sinova Izraelovih. To sam pobrekao, kaže.
So I wasn't remembering whether the gates were named after the
Nisam znao da
12
su vrata
tribes
po njima
or
nazvana
the apostles.
ili apostoli.
But what I'm trying to make the point here is that the apostles are 12 are significant even into eternity.
Značajnost 12 apostola čak se proteže u vječnost.
This calling of them in Luke 6 has a meaning even into eternity.
Ovaj poziv u Luka 6 ima svoje značenje i u vječnosti.
What we do now sometimes is going to have an impact into eternity.
Ono što činimo danas ima utjecaj i u vječnosti.
By the way, it's interesting in Revelation 21,
U Otkrivenju 21 zanimljivo je
verses we read there, 12 and 13,
stihova
14,
koje smo sad malo prije pročitali,
that the 12 tribes are separate
da su 12 plemena
than
odvojene,
the
drugačije
12 apostles.
nego li 12 apostola.
They're not melded into one.
Nisu stopljeni u jednu.
They're separate even in eternity.
Čak i u vječnosti to su dvije odvojene skupine.
The 12 tribes are memorialized with the 12 gates of the New Jerusalem.
12 plemena sa 12 vrata,
And the 12 apostles with the 12 foundation stones.
a 12 apostola sa 12 temelja.
For most of you, you're like, that's okay.
Većina vas bi, to je u redu.
But there's actually a big theological debate. Does Israel continue on as separate from
Postoji
the
velika
church?
teološka debata da li je Izrael i dalje nastavlja i da li je on odvojen od crkve.
Or does the church kind of swallow
Ili je crkva, tako reći, progutala Izrael.
and there's no more Israel in the future?
I u budućnosti više nema Izraela.
Those verses show that even in eternity there's a difference.
Ovi stihovi pokazuju da čak u vječnosti
And it all starts here
postoji
in
razlika.
Luke 6 when Jesus calls them after prayer
A sve počinje u Luka 6.
out of the disciples to be 12 of them apostles.
Nakon što je molio cijelu noć da ih on izabere i proziva apostolima.
Why does Jesus call the 12 to be apostles?
Zašto ih proziva da budu apostoli?
Mark 3 gives us at least a couple of reasons.
Marko 3. poglavlje nam podastire barem broj razloga.
This is a parallel passage to the Luke 6.
To je paralelni ulomak Luka 6.
And let's start in Mark 3:13.
Marko 3. poglavlje 13. stih. I uzađe na goru, pa dozove k sebi svoje sam. I dozove k sebi koje sam htijaše i otiđeše k njemu.
So this sounds pretty simple, straightforward.
Zvuči vrlo jednostavno, vrlo razumljivo.
But it says here that he calls them to be with him.
Ali ih je pozvao da budu s njime.
In verse 14.
U 14. stihu.
He appointed 12 for what purpose? That they would be with him.
I postavi 12 da budu s njime.
This is part of discipleship and apostleship. They're with him.
To je dio učeništva i apostolstva, da su oni sa njime.
You can't do discipleship, or in this case, even more intense discipleship, apostleship, from a distance.
Znači, učeništvo ili apostolstvo ne možeš vršiti na daljinu.
If you want to influence people, you have to be with them.
Ako želiš utjecati na ljude, moraš biti sa njima.
Sometimes seminarians want to be very much just a teacher from afar and not get with the people.
Nekada postdiplomski učitelji žele biti utjecajni na daljinu.
To shepherd sheep, you have to be with them, and you need to touch them. You need to get the things out of their hair, I'm told. I don't know this, but I'm told that.
Ti moraš biti sa stadom, da im vadiš čičak iz vune ili što god već treba.
You get dirty sometimes.
Da se malo zabrlješ.
It's difficult.
Jer je to teško.
And sometimes we want to avoid that, but Jesus did not.
Nekada to želimo izbjeći, međutim Isus nije to izbjegavao.
We can't have discipleship, or even closer, here was the apostleship, without being with them.
Učeništvo ili apostolstvo ne možemo vršiti, a da nismo sa ljudima.
And in verse 14, not only did he call them to be with him,
Ne samo da ih je pozvao da budu sa njime,
but that they might be sent them to preach. He sends them to preach.
on ih šalje da propovijedaju.
That's the second purpose of the calling of the 12.
To je druga svrha poziva 12-torice.
First purpose was that they would be with him.
Prva jeste da budu sa njime.
That's very important.
To je vrlo
First,
važno.
have influence on them.
Da vrši utjecaj na
And then
njih.
second, that they would be sent out.
A drugo, da ih on pošalje.
We can't do ministry by ourselves. We need to train others and send them.
Ne možemo sami vršiti službu, moramo druge obučavati i njih poslati.
One of the biggest mistakes of men in the ministry is they don't leave somebody else who can take their place when they are somewhere else or maybe in heaven.
Najveća greška propovednika je nekada da nemaju svoje zamjene, nemaju nikoga iza sebe kada treba negdje otići propovijedati jer nisu ovo radili.
So that is two reasons for the calling of the 12. To be with him and to send them
Ovo
out.
su dva razloga zašto je pozvao apostola, da budu sa njime i da ih može poslati da propovijedaju.
So that's the four callings of the
To su već
followers of Jesus.
poziva Isusovih sljedbenika, učenika i apostola.
Now I want to talk about the significance of the 12.
Sad nešto malo o značajnosti i važnosti 12-torice.
Number one,
Pod broj 1.
it was through them that Jesus wanted to reach the world.
Po njima je Isus htio zahvatiti svijet.
As we said earlier in the course, Jesus didn't write a book.
Kao što smo ranije rekli, Isus nije napisao knjigu.
He wasn't a great traveler all over the world evangelizing.
Nije putao po cijelom svijetu i evangelizirao.
He didn't have high degrees.
Nije imao visoke diplome.
But his main influence was to influence his 12 apostles, and through them to then influence the world, who would travel, who would write
On je htio utjecati na 12-toricu koja će kasnije putovati i utjecati na svijet.
Number two.
Broj 2.
Number one was through them he's reaching the world. That's very significant.
Po njima je dohvatio svijet, što je vrlo važno.
And number two
Broj 2.
is that God uses very ordinary, fallible humans
Bog koristi obične,
to do his work.
grešne ljude da bi obavio svoj posao.
The apostles weren't rich, famous,
Apostoli nisu bili bogati, nisu bili slavni.
especially elite people,
Nekakva elitna skupina.
and yet he used them to change the world.
A on ih je iskoristio da zahvate
And we're here
svijet.
because of that.
I zbog njih smo mi danas ovdje.
And that gives us hope that he can use us.
I to nam pruža nadu da i nas može slično koristiti.
The last thing I want to talk about is the description of the 12.
Zadnje, za danas hoću govoriti o opisu 12-torice.
In Mark, we were reading about his calling of the 12 and sending out of the 12.
U Marku smo i Mark,
Yeah, in Mark 3, we saw in verses
3 smo vidjeli kako je on poslao prve učenike.
called them to himself, sent them out to preach.
Pozvao ih sebi, pa ih je poslao da propovijedaju.
And then he names them.
I onda ih imenuje.
And I want to end our class today talking about the followers of Christ by looking at this chart where we line up all of the disciples.
Želim govoriti o njegovim sljedbenicima i da vidimo ovaj nacrt koji je na ekranu gdje su svi oni navedeni.
I don't know if you've ever compared the list before.
Ne znam ste li ikada uspoređivali popise apostola.
John doesn't have a list, but Acts does.
Ivan nema svoj popis, ali djela imaju.
So we got 3 Gospels and the Acts.
3 evanđelja i djela apostolska.
Maybe the first most obvious thing is who's the lead person in every single list.
Možda prvo što trebamo zamijetiti jeste ko je prvi lik i ko je prvi čovjek na svakom popisu.
That's because Peter was the leader of the 12.
Je Petar, jer je bio vođa 12-torice.
And who was what's the right word? The betrayer, the worst of the disciples, listed last.
Najgori, koji je ga izdao, on je na kraju, ne?
And Judas Iscariot is
Juda
the last one in all the Gospels.
On je zadnji u svim evanđeljima.
Now, note that I have highlighted the name of Peter, Philip,
Kao što vidite, podebljao sam Petra,
James.
Filipa i Jakova,
James of Alphaeus.
sin Alfeja.
So it's not Jesus' brother who wrote the Gospel
To
of
nije
James.
Isusov brat koji je pisao Jakovljevu poslanicu.
These names that are highlighted in bold are always in that position with the same people under their name.
Znači, ove koje sam podebljao, oni su uvijek na istom mjestu spiska, koji ispod sebe imaju određenu skupinu drugih apostola.
But the other names under them, not in bold, are sometimes changed order.
Međutim, ovi koji se navode ispod podebljenih imena, nisu uvijek u istom redoslijedu.
And it seems that it's possible that they are listed there because they are disciplers of the people under their name, or at least that's the idea that is being presented, and it might be a fact.
Moguće da je ideja da su ljudi ispod podebljenih imena učenici tih ili koji uče od tih.
We can't confirm it since the scripture isn't clear, but it might be that Philip was a leader of the group of the people under his name.
Ne možem to potvrditi, ali Filip je bio nekakav vođa ove trojice ispod sebe.
And that James, the son of Alphaeus, is a sub-leader of the names under his.
Alfejev je nekakav predstavnik ove trojice ispod sebe.
In addition to that, there's several relatives in this list.
U ovom popisu ćete naći i nekoliko rodbinskih veza.
Peter and Andrew are brothers,
I Andrija,
and James and John are brothers.
Jakov i Ivan su braća.
These are family relations.
To su rodbinske veze.
There's business relations.
Imamo i poslovne veze tu.
Several people are fishermen.
Neki od njih su ribari, OPG-ovci.
Peter and Andrew, James and John are all fishermen.
Jakov i Ivan, oni su ribari.
There's geographical connections in these lists.
Postoje i geografske povezanosti, znači blizina.
11 of the 12 apostles
11-torica, ove 12-torice
are all from Galilee.
su svi iz Galileje.
In fact, when Peter was caught trying to follow Jesus
Kad su Petra ulovili dok je slijedio
during his
Isusa
trial,
za vrijeme suđenja,
one of the servant girls says, I know that you're his follower.
Znam da si ti njegov sljedbenik.
The way you talk gives yourself away. You're a Galilean.
Govor te odaje, ti si Galilejac.
They probably had some kind of accent or special way that they talk.
Imali su sigurno svoj naglasak po kojemu su ih prepoznali.
Who was the only apostle who wasn't a Galilean?
Ko je taj apostol koji nije bio Galilejac?
Judas.
Juda.
Judas is from Iscariot.
Iskariotski, ne?
That's where he's from.
Od tud je taj.
There's a village of Iscariot.
Selo.
Jesus of Nazareth, Judas of Iscariot.
Isus iz Nazareta, Juda i Iskariotski.
Interesting that the betrayer
Zanimljivo da je izdajnik
is from a different area.
iz drugog jednog područja.
Several of the apostles have the same name.
Nekoliko ime, ali apostola nose isto ime.
Have you ever noticed that there's two Simons in the list?
Imamo dva Šimona u popisu.
Number one, Peter, if we want to call it number one, at the
Šimon
top,
Petar,
and Simon the Canaanite.
Šimon Kanaan.
Two Simons.
Dva Šimona.
There's two James or Jacobs.
Dva Jakova.
James, one of the three, son of Zebedee.
Jakov, sin Zebedejev.
And there's James, the son of Alphaeus.
I Jakov, sin Alfejev.
And there's also two Judases.
I imamo dva Jude.
Judas Iscariot
Juda Iskariotski
and Judas of James.
I Juda Jaković.
We see here in these two lists.
Vidimo u ovim popisima, ne?
The last thing I want to point out about the apostles is their diversity.
Raznolikost njihova je još što želim danas istaknuti ovdje.
We have 4 fishermen,
Imamo 4 ribara,
a tax collector,
jednog carinika,
which
poreznika,
pretty much everybody hated
koga su svi manje više mrzili,
because they were liars, cheats, and
lagali,
took
varali
more money than they were supposed
i
to.
uzimali više nego što su smjeli.
So they were considered the worst of society.
Najgori šljam društva.
And there was a nationalistic zealot,
I imali su nacionalistu među svojim redovima.
Simon the Zealot.
Šimon, revnitelj, ne? Zelot.
Lots of potential for conflicts.
Dovoljno ih je bilo koji su bili tu nastrojeni za konflikt.
Especially between Matthew the tax collector
Pogotovo između Mateja carinika
Simon the Zealot.
i Šimona.
They were exact opposites of
Oni
the
su bili na dvije različite tabora.
understanding of Israel and who their loyalties were
Njihovi
to.
pogledi na Izrael, na odanost i tako dalje.
This can give us hope.
I to nama daje nadu.
When we work with people,
Kada radimo s ljudima,
we have also all kinds of people from different walks of life, different political views.
imamo različite ljude među nama, različitih političkih opredeljenja ili gledišta na život.
And Jesus, who could change the hearts of these 12 apostles,
Isus koji je promijenio srca ove 12-torice
it's the same one working in the hearts of the people we're working.
je isti Isus koji može promijeniti srce ljudi s kojima mi radimo.
So we can take hope in that.
Tu nalazimo našu nadu.
As we're making disciples
Dok činimo učenike,
and we're teaching them,
dok ih poučavamo,
bringing them with us, to be with us as Jesus
kada ih
did,
pozivamo da budu sa nama uz nas,
to send them out to be preachers and fishers of men, as
kada ih
Jesus did.
šaljemo da budu propovednici, ribari ljudi,
As we see the conflicts and the difficulties,
kada promatramo sve te složenosti, poteškoće,
we can remember what Jesus did with these 12 simple,
sjetimo se što Isus
very
učinio
diverse,
sa običnom 12-toricom
and change the world.
i kako je promijenio svijet.
He can do that through us and with us.
To može po nama i sa nama.
I hope this survey of the disciples,
Nadam se da ovaj pregled ovih učenika,
who they were,
tko su oni bili,
their callings,
njihov poziv,
the significance of the 12,
značajnost te
and
12-torice
some of the details of the 12
i neke detalje koje smo saznali njima.
can help us as we try to also follow in the footsteps of Jesus and make disciples.
Pomoći će nam da mi idemo Isusovim stopama i da stvaramo učenike.
Amen.
Amen.
Why don't, Andy, you close us in a word of prayer. And then we, Lord willing, we hit the line.
Da ćemo na ručak.
Oče, zahvaljujemo Tebi za ovaj dan, zahvaljujemo Tebi za pouku, zahvaljujemo Tebi za brata Brusa koji nam je sve izložio i pomozi nam da uz pomoć Duha Tvojega možemo procesuirati sve ove informacije i Gospodine posložiti u naše srce, razmišljati o tome i u praksi iznijeti, Gospodine, da budemo učenici koji će biti upotrebljivi u Tvome kraljevstvu. Evo, molimo i za ručak koji je ispred nas, neka Tvoj blagoslov bude nad nama. Amen.
Amen. One more moment, or half a minute maybe, 1 minute.
Dajte mi još jednu minutu.
I will tell you the homework for tonight.
Vaš domaći uradak za večeras.
Tomorrow we will look at, Lord willing, the miracles of Jesus.
Sutra ćemo promatrati Isusova čudesna djela.
And this section is probably the section of the life of Christ where I learned the most personally.
Ovo je odjeljak kojem sam ja osobno najviše naučio.
I think it's one of the most interesting sections, in my opinion. You
Najzanimljiviji
will give your opinion later.
u ovom proučavanju Kristovog života i djela.
And in preparation for looking at the miracles of Jesus tomorrow,
U pripremi za Isusova čudesa koje ćemo sutra pogledati,
I want you to consider why did Jesus do miracles
razmotrite zašto je Isus činio čudesa.
and try to write down
Zapišite se.
what was the purpose of Jesus' miracles
Koja je svrha Isusovih čudesa?
and what do miracles teach us about Jesus.
I što nas čudesa uče o Isusu?
And we'll talk about that, Lord willing, tomorrow.
I to ćemo uz Božju pomoć sutra.
And we'll also have a test on today's lecture material.
A imat ćemo i
Lord
kviz
willing.
za ono što smo danas prošli.
You are free.